Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you as always for joining me for another edition of the show. A few weeks ago, I had my friend Neha from Girls at the Ballpark on, and we were talking about the MLB playoffs. And I like to credit her and my conversations with her for making me interested in wanting to consume the playoffs again. And I did this year. I live in the Seattle area, so it was kind of cool to be able to watch the Mariners go on the run in the city area that I'm living in. And just from the fact that it was so unexpected, just considering how long it's been since they have advanced that far into the playoffs, over 20 years. And the tone after they lost in 7 games to the Blue Jays was that this this team got so far, but they couldn't get to the mountaintop, and it got me thinking a bit about how we view team success when it doesn't lead into a championship. By any conceivable metric, the Mariners season was a success, right? It's the first time in 24 years, I believe it is, since they got to the ALCS. At the beginning of the year, they were plus 2,500 to win the World Series. So that's 12th highest. And they were among the last 4 teams standing and conceivably came close to being in the World Series playing against the Dodgers. You could argue about how they lost those games. They had leads in every single game, and just couldn't get it done, right? But they were not supposed to be there. They were a team that was projected to be okay and maybe a wild card team, and then that's it. A lot of people thought that that they would just fizzle out pretty quickly. They had a couple interesting players, Julio Rodriguez and Kyle Raleigh, but ultimately this wasn't a championship level team, and they defied those expectations. And for that, they deserve to be recognized. But even more than that, they're a franchise now. I think it's the only franchise in history of the MLB who hasn't been to a World Series ever. Somebody could probably check me on that. But they have a history of coming up short, which is ironic because the Mariners also have a history of interesting players. Well, you go back to Ichiro, you go back to Ken Griffey, Edgar Martinez, Alex Rodriguez, before everybody hated him, and Randy Johnson, right? Just a lot of interesting players. And they have this history of coming up short, of being this kind of snake bitten franchise that can't figure it out. And, they're elevating when other teams that are more well built are also elevating. So they have this history of disappointment where those fans aren't able to feel the big one. But when you have a team that is used to disappointment in that manner, it becomes more significant, I think, when they become good. And, you know, I often joke that it's not an episode of my podcast unless I bring up the Knicks. And well, here's my time to bring up the Knicks. The Knicks this past year, kind of similar situation, right? It had been 20 plus years since they were in the Eastern Conference Finals, and they finally got there and ultimately lost in 6 games to the Pacers, who went on to lose to Oklahoma City in the finals. And there's parallels there, right? The Knicks were this moribund franchise, couldn't get out of its way, wasted the prime of somebody like Carmelo Anthony, which you can argue is kind of how Ichiro's tenure in Seattle went, with a lack of playoff success. And there is something to be celebrated about returning to the doorstep, right? And there's something to be celebrated about making a run, the memories that are created from an unlikely run. And I think we sometimes forget about that because we're so determined about legacy, dynasty, how many titles have you won? What's your candidacy for greatest of all time? That we sometimes forget that watching a team defy expectations and go far, even if it doesn't lead to a championship, can still be fulfilling, can still be rewarding for a fan base. I talked to a few people around here, and people don't really watch, maybe don't watch baseball a ton or don't watch sports a lot. And, they were getting into it. They were, we do school drop off here at an elementary school for my partner's two youngest. And all the kids are wearing Mariners gear. All the parents are wearing Mariners gear throughout this playoff run, and that matters. To use the Knicks example, you go and see people in the streets of Manhattan celebrating winning a second round series, and they were laughed at for that, right? They were like, "Oh, typical Knicks fans can't handle success, don't know how to handle success, blah 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 blah." And I'm just like, you need to be able to celebrate that. Like, also in NBA, Portland, they just reacquired Damian Lillard. That's significant, right? Because of what he means to the city. And, it's not all championships. And it gets me into this obsession that we have with titles. I want to say, I don't think it was there when Bill Russell rattled off a bunch of titles, when the Yankees in the early days of baseball before segregation was lifted were winning a bunch of titles. I really want to say this is a Jordan era situation because Jordan went 6 for 6, right? He got to the final 6 times, won every time, and was finals MVP every time. His greatness is largely defined by that as the ultimate winner. And we have glossed over so often his failings in the 80s, his multiple retirements, his tenure with the Wizards. We kind of erased it from memory. And we are left with this. This is the peak of greatness. We do it with Tom Brady. This is the peak of 7 Super Bowls. How can you get past that? And we fail to recognize the greatness of the others that came up in that era he was doing the winning against, right? It discredits Peyton Manning and Drew Brees a lot. It discredits Charles Barkley, Clyde Drexler, Gary Payton, John Stockton. Those era of players are discredited by the narrative of Jordan, right? And I think and that's how we measure current players, right? Well, Giannis, you can't stay in Milwaukee because you got to win more rings to be up there in the upper echelon. Yeah, you won one, but don't you want to win more? And the flip side of that is, think about somebody like Dirk Nowitzki. He won one, right? But his career is viewed in a way that is celebrated. It should be celebrated more, I would say. He has the one finals run, but he stuck it out with Dallas for a long time. It's a good story, right? It's the loyal soldier who came in from Germany, adapted, became beloved, redefined his position, and won a title for his trouble. It's the reason why I always hate the critiques of Patrick Ewing. And Patrick Ewing, my favorite Nick all time. And he helped get them to the finals twice. More so the first time than the second time when he was injured in '99. And he is knocked for never winning it, right? Never winning the title. But that doesn't mean he wasn't one of the best centers to ever play. It doesn't mean he wasn't one of the best shot blocking centers to ever play. And I sometimes feel like we open up that basketball, pro football, baseball reference page, and we see, hey, this guy has this many titles. This should tell you how great this person is. When a lot of times there's more nuance to the story and there's more to it than just the ring count. Because again, if you're a great player, and like Jerry West is a great example here, went to so many finals, lost a bunch of them. Elgin Baylor, same thing. These are 2 of the 50 greatest players to ever live. But if you were only to measure by ring count, you would have, in today's parlance, we would call them fraudulent. Like, no, they just lost to an incredibly well assembled Celtics team again and again and again and again. Right. And that is the obsession that we have with rings. It's like the ring culture thing that really bothers me, that we need to be able to appreciate greatness, even if there are stumbles, even if it's not clean, right? Even if it's not, I'm awesome. We won a bunch of games and I won a championship. Sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes you get a John Starks game 7 performance. Sometimes you get, a crazy fluke catch that stops you from the Super Bowl, that sort of thing. So I think that it's an obsession that we have that kind of taints the way we view and talk about sports and talk about teams. Next is just like, let's think about the emotional connection here for the fans in Seattle, right? You have a city. It's such an interesting sports city now that I've lived here. MLS is interesting here because the Sounders have been so solid for so long and they have a really good regional rivalry with the Portland Timbers. But MLS is MLS, right? It's kind of in the far reaches. The Seattle Storm have been an awesome franchise, but they're kind of undergoing a little bit of a rebuilding situation ever since they lost Brianna Stewart. This is a huge NFL town. They love the Seahawks. And then you have the Mariners, who are they like this team, and this team is so interesting with its young players, and with a well liked manager in Dan Wilson. But there's a togetherness that playoff baseball kind of creates that not many sports have, and you felt it in the air here about this whole state of Washington was just kind of rallying around this Mariners team in a way that felt very unique for 2025 rhetoric. And that's the power and connectivity of sports, right? And historically, you're not going to look back in this Mariners team and think anything of them. No one ever remembers the team that lost in the conference championship or the AL or NLCS. No one, people barely remember the team that lost in the championship series, right? Whether it's NBA Finals or World Series or Super Bowl or whatever, they typically remember the winners more. And I think that's a shame because we should want to celebrate the emotional connection. I know a few Pacers fans that I follow online. I've talked to a couple on this podcast, even like Ryan Rucker, big Pacers fan. I remember chatting with him after an episode, and we were just kind of offline chatting, and just about what that Pacers run meant to him, and what it was something that he was able to share with his daughters. It's like, hey, remember when Tyrese Halliburton went on this crazy run of game winners here, right? You think about the stuff that Reggie Miller did when he was there, and that's this type of stories you tell people after, um, after it happens, and it's the myth building. Like I think about who my dad isn't a huge basketball fan, but in the 90s he was. In the late 80s and early 90s he was. He was fascinated by Michael Jordan, and he was really interested in the Bad Boy Pistons. And I remember, I'll never forget this. He told me the story of the Isaiah Thomas um, broken foot game against the Lakers in the finals in '88, and that was, and that's a story that really resonated with me and stuck with me as a basketball fan. And that is of a player who lost that series, right? A player and a team that lost that series. And I think about that's the one he chose to stick with me, right? Not their domination of the Lakers the following year, not the domination of the Trailblazers, So that is the emotional resonance of sports. You think about for the Mariners, Cal Raleigh doing things that no catcher really should be able to do, hitting for power and the wear and tear of catching every single game on your knees, and it's such a physically demanding position. But he still captured the imagination. You think about somebody like Julio Rodriguez, whose potential has no limits. Right, he's still incredibly young, and I think back on. I was talking to some friends of mine who are Detroit Lions fans, and I was like, you guys really should appreciate the fact that you're in the golden era of your franchise's history right now. It may not lead into a championship, because it's hard. Winning titles is hard, in every professional sport. It's not easy in any sport. And so, yeah, you might only get to an NFC championship game, but don't take for granted the joy of this team brings you week in, week out, day in, day out. and to take a step back and enjoy that. I think about my Knicks fandom. I went through 20 plus years of irrelevance until Julius Randle came, and then Jalen Brunson came, and this team started winning games, started being relevant again, started showing itself as a competent organization. I wrote a piece on Medium a while ago about how the 2020-2021 Knicks saved my life mentally, right? Because it was something that I had to look forward to. This team that came out of nowhere during a COVID year when I was in a tough situation personally. And that is something that sticks with you. And, you know, the funny thing is, a lot of teams that they make documentaries about, that they write books about, aren't your dynasties typically. Like I think about Jeff Pearlman, who just released a book about Tupac that I intend on reading. Jeff's one of my favorite sports authors, and he ventured into hip hop, which I'm very curious to see how that translates. But his first book was about the mid '80s Mets, who won one title, '85 Mets, an iconic team, just like incredibly filled with these fascinating characters, and that is good theater. That's super interesting, right? And yes, there are books about the Showtime Lakers and the Kobe and Shaq Lakers and the Patriots and the Bulls, but I sometimes find the ones that are interesting are about the ones that failed ultimately, like had a little bit of success but failed. Chris Herring's book, Blood in the Garden, about the 90s Knicks, we glorify that era. We also glorify the Reggie Miller Pacers, right? In that same era. A lot of people love the Kemp and Peyton Sonics. These are all teams that never won a title, right? And there are just different types of teams that really capture the imagination. And it shouldn't just be requisite to say, hey, let's just only talk about this team because they won the title. Think about the 90s Bills. Such a fascinating team for the era with Jim Kelly, Thurman Thomas, Andre Reed, kind of the triplets model that the Cowboys used with Irvin, Aikman, and Smith. And with just incredibly high octane, and they still are revered in Buffalo, right? And so, I think about today, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert. Is their ability fully diminished because they never won a title? Obviously, you want to get to a Super Bowl and win the Super Bowl. That's the goal, but that doesn't diminish their talent, I don't think. And sometimes I think we have to appreciate the journey here, right? And understand what they went through to get to that point. I think about the Giants when they had the one good year with Daniel Jones and how I felt as a Giants fan watching it. At that point, it'd been 5, 6 years removed from the last Eli Super Bowl, and there was turmoil around the team, and you were looking for stabilization, you were looking for something to latch onto. And here's this guy who a lot of people felt that was overdrafted, and this new head coach, and they were somehow, some way winning games, and it wasn't pretty, but they got it done, right? And it wasn't like they had a crazy season, but they won 9, 10 games, get to the first round, and they beat the favored Vikings, and that was such a great moment. That was such a great moment for me as a fan because you got a taste again of what success feels like, right? Got you to believe again, right? And that deserves to be celebrated, and I think that we get so caught up that we just, so where's the title, expectations, expectations, expectations. We can sometimes forget to enjoy the ride. And for Mariners fans, there's nothing to be ashamed of, right? You were a team that was projected to probably be on the outside looking into the playoff picture by a lot of people, and you made a run, and you got within a game, within a few outs of the World Series. There's nothing to be ashamed of about that. And I think that the overall takeaway here is that we should be able to appreciate what our teams offer us, what enjoyment they offer us, and what traditions we build around that. I think about friends who I've known who've been Bears fans for a long time. They love doing the tailgates and they have their own traditions, and they still love their team even though they can be maddening at times. It just shows the depth of sports, right? What it can bring us, what it can give to us, in on top of just wanting to watch success. because I'm a firm believer that people who like jump from team to team, because they're just riding the wave, like, like, oh, I love the Chiefs, and then it'll soon become, I love this other team. And they don't that's fine. You could do that for you. I'm not gonna police how people feel, how people fan, fan however you want to fan. But there's something about putting in time to see through a rebuild, to see a team rise up from the ashes that you knew weren't there. I think about Pistons fans I knew. The Pistons were, for the last decade, one of the worst teams in the NBA, if not the worst, right next to the Charlotte Hornets. And they were a laughing stock. The owners, like, drunk at games, was just bad, right? Then Cade Cunningham pops. They get a lot of contributions from guys like Asar Thompson and Malik Beasley. All of a sudden, they're in a long first round series with the Knicks, and came close to winning that series. And that feeling, that it's impossible to capture that if you are not fully invested in a team long term. And that's the beauty of sports, right? Yes, winning titles is awesome. Yes, parades are awesome. But you know what? So is being an unexpected, competent organization that goes further than you should have. And that deserves to be celebrated. So good job, Mariners. Great season. I'm excited for the World Series. I think a lot of people have a foregone conclusion about the Dodgers winning this thing because they're just so stacked, and Shohei Otani is just an alien. But I'm excited to see it. I want to see how it goes out. And I've always had a interesting fascination with the Blue Jays, and I'd like to see them win one. I think that'd be cool. And but I'm hoping that you all will also be watching the World Series in addition to all other sports we have going on, and enjoy your teams. Enjoy the development, enjoy building up and trying to get to the mountaintop. It's what makes being a fan so cool. All right, everybody. Thank you as always for joining me for another edition of the show. If you like this episode, you could give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and audio only on YouTube. You also follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube Shorts, where I occasionally upload clips from this podcast, most typically when I have a guest, but sometimes you'll see some clips from me there as well. Make sure to follow my written work on both Medium and Substack, and I'll have the links in the bottom of the show notes so you can check those out. As always, thank you for tuning in to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. We'll talk to you next time. I'm your host, Omar Zaran.